Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for joining this luncheon discussion. My name is Mike Harrington. I'm the chair of the Young Professionals Committee here at the American Chamber of Commerce. We are delighted, the Communications Committee is delighted to host this event with two people from Deloitte that are going to speak about reputational risk management and issues related to this. They have a survey on your chairs that if you would like to fill it out, they would love for you to participate in this reputation risk survey. I think Neil is going to speak a little bit more about it in a minute to explain what it is. Just before we get started, I'd like to just do some AmCham housekeeping. So when you come to these events, I'm sure most of you have been to these before. We all meet each other. We have these name tags. The name tags are color-coded. So if you see somebody with a yellow name tag like mine or a red name tag, that means that we are volunteer leaders here. We are committee chairs or board members. Those of you who have a blue sticker on your name tag are members of the American Chamber of Commerce. And those of you who do not have a blue sticker are future members of the American Chamber of Commerce. And we really look forward to you signing up and coming on board. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Neil Archibald and Melissa Fung from Deloitte. They're going to have a very interesting conversation for us, a discussion that they're going to lead, and we hope to have a really dynamic question and answer session afterwards. So, as you're sort of filling out your surveys and listening, think about what you'd like to ask them afterward. Guys?
Thank you. Maybe first of all, let me introduce myself first. I am Melissa Fung, partner of Deloitte Enterprise Risk Services. Beside me is Neil. He is our associate director. And for myself and Neil, we are specializing in providing crisis management and also risk management or corporate governance advisory services. And in the coming 40 to 45 minutes, I will share with you one of the global survey results conducted by our global Deloitte office on reputation risk. And then after that, Neil will talk about crisis management and reputation risk management in more detail. First of all, before I go into the detailed survey results, I would like to ask, what do you think about what is the meaning of reputation? I think many people will have a different answer because if you think about what is reputation, you may think that it is a perception of the other stakeholders on your company. But how to really define reputation? In Deloitte, we are trying to define it by saying that reputation is a measurement of performance against expectations. So when we talk about expectations, usually for a company, the stakeholders' expectations is derived from the company history, the track record, and also if something forward-looking. For example, your strategy, your business plans, your forward moves. When we talk about performance, actually you can say definitely talking about the actual performance in terms of financial and also non-financial results. But also, when we talk about performance, it is also talking about communications. That means is how the company shape the opinions and the images in the media or in the general public or in the market. Back in last year, our global Deloitte office conducted a reputation risk survey, and we received over 300 C-suite level people or board members about their responses. And those C-suite personnel and board members comes from around the world, for example, including Americas, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia-Pacific. So that means the results for this survey is quite representative for the whole, for the whole global market. And here are the 6 key insights that we derived from the survey results. The first one is talking about the reputation risk is a top strategic business risk. Reputation risk is a board and C-suite issue. Reputation risk is driven by other business risk. companies are least prepared for risk drivers beyond their direct control. And loss of revenue and brand value are key impacts, and companies are focusing more attention and resources on reputation risk. So maybe let's look at all these 6 insights in more detail. Based on the survey results, about 87% of the executives think that reputation risk are more important or much more important than other strategic risk in their companies. And about 88% of them say that their companies are explicitly focusing on techniques to manage reputation risk. And when we do the survey, we also conduct certain interviews with those C-suite people, and some of them mentioned that managing reputation risk is just like a priceless asset, and it should be, a reputation should be protected as if it is a matter of life and death. So that means they really treasure the reputation of the company and recognize the value for protecting the reputation. And also, some of the C-suite people think that when you manage reputation risk, it is a little bit, definitely it is important, but also it is very tricky. Because unlike, say, for example, if you need to manage, say, compliance risk or legal risk, you know that you are operating in what kind of a legal environment, and there are boundaries within that legal environment. Because the rules and regulations are there, it is clearly defined. What you need to do is just to make sure you comply with them. This is something that it is more controllable. But if you talk about reputation, there may be no boundaries, or the boundaries may be very vague. So that means it is sometimes it's very hard to control the reputation risk. And it is also particularly important for MNC to manage reputation risk, because MNC as a global player, if you think about it, something happened in China, may be known in US within a few hours, due to the technology and also the social media impact nowadays. And the second insight is about reputation risk is a board and C-suite issue. As you can see, many companies who participated in our survey think that the responsibilities for managing reputation risk resides at the highest levels of the organizations. Obviously, definitely it's the CEO, and some people think that it's the CRO, and also the board, and also the CFO as well. But when we conduct the interviews with those C-suite people, we recognize that there are several or different governance structure when we talk about the reputation risk management. For example, for some of the MNCs, they will have a designated chief risk officer or a risk committee to manage or to coordinate the risk management of the whole organization. And very often nowadays, there's a trend that this kind of risk committee or the CRO are more combined with the strategic function or strategic or business planning function. Because when you talk about reputation risk, it is also interrelated to many other risks as well. So that's why they want to more focus, more align the reputation risk management with the company strategies. But on the other hand, for some of the MNCs, we noticed that instead of having a designated, for example, risk committee or a designated person, say CRO, to manage reputation risk, some of the MNCs choose to take the whole board or all the management accountable for managing reputation risk. That means, for example, some of the companies may have a risk steering team or risk steering committee to coordinate the whole risk management process, and then submit for example, the risk management results to the whole board or all the executive management for evaluation. And the third insight is about reputation risk is driven by other business risk. And as I said before, many executives think that reputation risk is a result of some of the other underlying risk. Based on the survey results, you can see that about 43% of the executives think that risk relating to products and services are the key drivers for the reputation risk. When we talk about products and services, we are talking about, for example, product safety, health, and also environmental issues. And when dealing with product and services risk, companies will very often strengthen, for example, their internal controls or their compliance mechanism in relation to the quality of their products, safety of their products or services as well. And the second top drivers for the reputation risk is security. When we talk about security, we are talking about from a more physical and also cyber breaches perspectives. And some of the key executives think that in order to manage these kind of security risk, it is very important for the companies to have to establish a very strong infrastructure to defend against physical and also cyber security risk. But as you can see, the top drivers that drive the reputation risk is about ethics and integrity. And that means it's associated with fraud, bribery, and also corruption. And the executives think that it is very important for the company to have a strong ethical policies or framework. And also, because when you talk about ethics and integrity, that means we are talking about people. Besides having a policy, just a paper itself, it is also very important to put emphasis on recruitment, training as well. And there's no surprise that when we do the survey with the respondents, these top 3 types of drivers identified in this survey are the same as those drivers identified by some of the companies that have experienced major reputation risk event in the past. So that means the results aligns with actually what's happened. And one of the emerging drivers is talking about third-party risk. Because many companies think that, for example, product and services, securities, these things, it is easily, it is more direct and controllable. But when you talk about third-party risk, it is it is more indirect, less controllable, and so that's why many of the companies are also start looking at how to manage third-party risk. And another insight from the survey is that companies are least prepared for risk drivers beyond their direct control. This is just what I just said before. As you can see, companies feel more prepared to manage reputation risk drivers in areas such as regulatory compliance and also employee misconduct or even executive misconduct, because they think that these are something more internal or more controllable, but they feel less prepared for risk drivers such as third-party ethics, competitive attacks, hazards, things that are less controllable. For example, if you think of some of the recent incidents, say I quote some of the food safety incidents happened in China, those MNCs in fact are affected by their vendors. That is a third-party risk, right? So that means as an MNC, you should really, or as an executive, you should really think about, besides strengthening your in-house internal controls mechanisms or the risk mitigation measures, does your company really have any measures or plans to monitor and manage those third-party issues? For example, is your supplier management mechanism really well in place? Do you really know what your vendors or suppliers are doing? And if something happened to your suppliers or vendors, will you really actually can those events be identified on a timely basis so that you will have enough time to respond? This is one of the key questions relating to the third-party risk management as well. And as you can see, some of the, when they talk about the key drivers, some of the executives think that when they deal with reputation risk, internally driven issues are often quickly dealt with. But at the same time, they're really worried about the consequential impacts where reputational issues continue to escalate and evolve even though the underlying issue has been mitigated. That means, for example, even you believe that yourself already have a very strong supplier management mechanism, but if your vendor is in a very remote area, say in a very remote province in China, if something really happened, will you know about that on a timely basis so then you can respond immediately? When we talk in the survey, we also ask about some of the key impacts of the reputation risk. And the majority of the respondents see the impact of reputation risk is on revenue and also the loss of brand value. But this one is just a total response results. As you can see, loss of brand value and also loss of revenue both have 41% of response for that. But if we drill into particular industry, for example, for consumer and industrial products, companies may have a slightly different view on that. Those consumer business companies see the impact on revenue and loss of brand value as the biggest impact. But if you talk about FI, financial institutions, they also have they will have a different point of view. They think that the impact of reputation risk will be regulatory investigations and also the stock price drop. But this is not surprising because when we interview some of the C-suite people in the FI industry, they think that regulatory compliance is so important. It is because if the industry as a whole really can comply with those regulations, this can reduce the likelihood of the regulators to strengthen the current regulations. Because as you can imagine, if the regulations is further strengthened, this will also increase the cost of compliance of those financial institutions. So that's why they think that the key impacts of the reputation risk is on regulatory side rather than, unlike consumer companies, let's say they're less concerned about the loss of revenue and also the loss of brand value. And another insights from the survey is about when we notice that and more companies are focusing attention and resources on managing reputation risk. As you can see, about 63% of them are investing in technology solutions. For example, they're investing on brand monitoring tools, data analytics tools, so that they can gather more information in order to manage the reputation risk. And also, around 58% of them are investing in data services. That means they are, for example, buying media monitoring, surveying services, and also social media data. Because all these, the reason behind for all these is they would like to capture or analyze the data so that they can have a red flag or analysis in order to provide them with more information to protect their reputation. And about 50% of them are investing in people. That means when they are trying to deal with the reputation risk, they also try to hire the CRO, Chief Risk Officer, and also crisis managers as well. And about 40% of them are developing reputation risk process, for example, the reputation risk monitoring and also response mechanism. And also about 37% of them are even developing crisis management capabilities. For example, setting up crisis management team within the company, develop a crisis management plan, doing crisis simulations. Because when we talk about crisis management, we are talking about how prepared you are when you face a crisis. That means we are talking about monitoring, preparation, and also rehearsal. And also when we talk about crisis, we are talking about how fast you can respond and also about the quality of your response. And why people are doing crisis simulation is that because they want to make their executives or the whole companies be more prepared, just like doing a rehearsal or simulation or scenario planning, so that if really something happened, people will exactly know what to do and there won't be a surprise. And if you look at geographic areas, it seems that Asia-Pacific is investing more in crisis management than other regions. This is also not really that surprised about that, because even if you talk about just generic risk management, as you can see, the risk management practices in Asia-Pacific companies, you can say is less sophisticated if you compare to companies in the Americas and also in Europe. And but because of the recent different incidents happened in the Asia-Pacific area, the companies are more concerned about, starting to be more concerned about crisis management capabilities. So that's why more and more Asia-Pacific companies are trying to look into how they can be more well prepared when the crisis really comes. And besides talking about the 6 key insights derived from the survey, we also conducted interviews with those C-suite people, and here are some of their leading practices that they share with us. For example, SAP, they have, when they talk about reputation risk management, they have set up, for example, a business continuity management and also crisis management program, not only at the global level, but also at the main locations, supported by the regional and also the global teams as well. And also another company is that they we try to prepare a global risk agenda to identify the different types of risk within the group, and also updated that agenda on a regular basis. But the key thing is that very often many companies just try to identify the risk but doing nothing. But this CRO really thinks that after you really identify the risk, focus on the mitigation. That means not only identify the mitigation measures, but also checking on the progress, checking whether those mitigations are really up to date and reflect and can really reflect the actual circumstances. And also another leading practices is about regular external reputation monitoring. For this company, they constantly engaged analysts, investors, and also customers to gather their point of views or their perceptions or the information relating to the reputation of the company. Because they think that, as I said before, if you would like to strengthen your internal controls mechanisms or mitigation plans, it is something that is really controllable. But at the same time, you need to understand what the market, what is the market perception on your company. So that's why this company constantly talk to an analyst and investors and also customers, say for example, even doing some customer surveys, and in order to gather information about their reputation, about the reputation of the company, because they want to get a more external point of view rather than operate in a black box, just focusing on strengthening their internal mechanism or risk management measures, but they also want to get insights from the outside, from the external party. So that's all for the global survey result sharing. Do you have comments so far? If not, then maybe I will pass the time to Leo, and he will talk about managing reputation risk and also crisis management.
Can I fill the microphone? Sure. I think I might just stand up and wander around a little bit. Is that on? Okay. So I think one thing that's clear is that most organizations probably have incidents going on regularly. In all of our organizations, probably right now, there's a number of IT bug fixes, patching, and so forth, infrastructure and facilities issues, or perhaps HR issues. And these are common business as usual. This is day-to-day stuff. But what is important is understanding the escalation from when an incident moves to a more serious level and starts to become probably what we would regard as a crisis. Probably one of the defining components of that is when reputation risk is introduced. So what we're going to do now is try and delve into some more of the granular protocols, structures that we should have in place to formalize some of these ideas we've been hearing from Melissa about what reputation risk is and how we can actually implement it into something actionable within our organizations. So I think that reputation risk can't be wholly avoided because of a number of growing trends in the current global operating environment. Firstly, there's a great deal of complexity around stakeholder values and interests. These are driven by cultural, socioeconomic, financial, ethical, regulatory reasons. So it's very difficult to draw the exact causation between cause and effect when it comes to reputational risk. Very difficult to identify exactly what it is that you do that will result in a great deal of interest, public scrutiny of your activities. There's also, at the macro level, increasing amounts of transparency and accountability for all businesses. So again, regulators are more and more interested in what organizations are doing. The public are more and more interested, especially if you're in perhaps what would be deemed as a systemically important industry like financial services or energy, power utilities. And lastly, I think the modern operating environment is defined very well by the acronym VUCA, which is probably something we've all heard. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So we're in a position whereby reputation risk, to some extent, has to be accepted and mitigated and managed. Can't be completely avoided. I think another aspect of crisis, when we think about it across organizations, across sectors, across geographies, is that it may or may not have a direct impact on your tangible assets, your life safety, your infrastructure, your people, your resources. But what is clear is that there's going to be some potential of threat to your key intangible assets, reputation and brand. And what we see from this data is that these intangible assets are actually some of the most critical to the continuation of your business model and public confidence in your services and products. This diagram tries to sort of illustrate some of what we were hearing about in the survey, whereby reputation risk can be understood to be this amplification layer sitting above discrete, functional, domain-specific risks within the enterprise. So where an incident may occur in any one of these discrete areas, it's when it achieves a certain level of severity and passes through this sort of amplification layer of reputation risk that we're essentially dealing with a crisis. So actually, how you think about reputation risk, where you situate it within your framework of risk management, your wider enterprise risk management architecture, is an interesting question that organizations have to do. And I think this is something that's developing in maturity at the moment. An interesting exercise for any organization to undertake will be to define exactly what crisis will mean for them. To actually have some sort of statement and policy to define what crisis is. So I've tried to attempt a fairly broad description here. We're talking about a major catastrophic event or indeed a series of escalating events. So this is either the big event or the discovery of severe problems in governance and process that result in an event. And when we talk about event, we're talking about really across the spectrum of risks. So physical or cyber attack on your organization, or it could be financial crime. It could be industrial disruption, supply chain, counterparty failure, financial distress, insolvency, bankruptcy, shareholder activism, and indeed other external drivers of risk, natural catastrophe, counterparty failure, so forth, slightly more beyond your control. The organization, whatever that may be, public, private sector, not-for-profit, and it threatens your strategic objectives, so your revenue target, valuation, market share, resources and relationships, or your reputation, your credibility, brand, trust, however you're measuring that, or your viability, profitability, solvency, infrastructure, your capability, your social and your political license to operate. So what we're going to do now is try to take some of these concepts and make them slightly more tangible and think about some of the actual structures, processes, policies, technologies that you need to implement within your organization to manage reputation risk. There needs to be a preparation and readiness phase whereby we actually set up this program. You need to have a response organization, some sort of group of people that are capable of getting around a table and making decisions in the instance of a severe disruption. You need to have some sort of crisis management plan to actually act as a playbook to guide you through this. A common operating picture, a one unified view of the truth of what is actually happening both internally and externally. A decision-making process, so some sort of handrail for driving you through these severe, high-pressure decisions that you'll have to make that very much differ from business as usual. And a control hierarchy, so an understanding of how roles and responsibilities and processes for interaction exist across your organization, across boundaries. A crisis communications plan, internal and external, an information management process, and some understanding of how you will interact with the public sector stakeholders that are likely to have a vote in how you're managing this crisis. So initially, looking at the preparation and response process, we can understand crisis management to be a cycle of readiness, response, and recovery. Of these, arguably the most important is the readiness. If you do readiness well, you've got a decreased chance of having to do the response and recovery. And when you do have to do them, you've set the conditions for success. So what would getting ready look like? You have to define the strategy. How does your organization understand crisis management? How is it defining crisis? How does it sit within your wider enterprise risk management architecture? You should take a risk-based approach. So whatever you're resourcing, your crisis response, that should be aligned to what you understand your top risks, your strategic risks to be, those that really impinge upon the continuation of your business model. And there will also be this panoply of existing incident management processes across functional areas. So some understanding of how you're going to connect these incident management processes at the functional level to an enterprise crisis management process. You need to think about the governance of this program. Who is the sponsor? Who is the owner? If we don't give ownership to someone, it won't go anywhere. There needs to be some understanding of how we're going to resource it, how we're going to invest in it. So we need to undertake the business case. As with any process of risk management, there needs to be a trade-off between protection and the ability to continue business as usual. So we need to think about what degree we're doing that. And aligning it to existing other governance structures. If you operate in an organization that is using a 3 lines of defense model, then how does your crisis management or business continuity system sit across 3 lines of defense? Then we can design the program in terms of the ecosystem of policies and procedures and technologies that need to be in place, and then implement these and test where possible. So that program of progressive crisis simulations, identifying different risk scenarios and finding out how capable we are of responding to them is an important process. And then we can monitor the program in terms of monitoring horizon scanning for risks and threats, and also monitoring the program itself, reporting on KPIs upwards. So every organization should clearly have a defined idea of what the crisis management team will be, whatever you want to call it. The crisis management team should be a strategic body. It should have the authority of the board, sit at the senior management level. It should be based upon the scale of your organization. So the smaller organizations will need to do this differently to large global networks. But a useful framework for thinking about this is the strategic, operational, and tactical division. The crisis management team needs to be a strategic body that's capable of making the big decisions that are going to affect the business, the continuity of the business. It's also important to think about the division of command and control. These are separate concepts, and they need to be separate functions within the crisis management team. So here, where we've got the crisis owner, that's really the command function. This is the leader who has the one step back from what's going on, the ability to make the big decisions when it matters. We've got control as well with the chief of staff. So this is the person who's actually driving the process forward, generating the information feeds, getting people around the table, driving the timeline, resourcing the communications and so forth to allow the crisis owner that space to be a commander rather than a controller. There's also an important administrative element that needs to be considered, and vitally, this needs to sit across functions. So all the functions that are relevant within your organization need to be around the table. And this can be a flexible model based on the nature of the situation. So strategic decisions, and then an operational planning of the response, and a tactical delivery. Crisis management plan is another important component. So one of the major problems that I have seen in the past, working with clients on these, is that sometimes they look like a Bible, or maybe even a collection of Bibles. And they're sitting on a shelf gathering dust. They're not a live document. And they're somewhere between a policy and a playbook. So a policy is something that's defining the program itself. This is not that. This is your playbook for actually enabling your response, allowing you to make these decisions under pressure. So small, concise, short is good. So a framework for what a good crisis management plan might look like. To some extent, we need to define the scope up front. What are we actually talking about? So that definition of crisis for whatever it means for the organization. The organizational objectives, perhaps across different scenarios, cyber, natural disaster, investigation, and so forth. What are we aiming to optimize for? Is it continuation of service delivery? Is it maintaining our regulatory compliance? Is it life safety of our employees? Is it the safety of our customers? It depends on the nature of the organization. The crisis management team. So who are these people who are going to get around the table and make these decisions? Categorization framework, where possible, quantitative. So can we actually get to a stage where we can define X number of lost revenue, X number of service outage hours defines crisis? If you can get to that stage, you're at quite a mature level. Contact information, very practical consideration. There's a very real chance that your senior people are not all in one room ready to get together and resource this response. So how are we going to work across boundaries and time zones to do this? And then an idea of the decision-making process. So business as usual, we probably have a lot of flexibility about how long we can take to make decisions. In a crisis situation, you need to make decisions relatively quickly. Timely response is everything. So having some sort of handrail for how you're going to drive through these decisions is important. The communications plan, external and internal. The resourcing and logistics as well. What actual equipment are you going to need in the room? How are you going to get in touch with all your stakeholders? Templates where possible, so you can do crisis diagnosis, where you can fill in information and you have these things already set up. You're not trying to set them up as you use them. An information management process, cross-references to the wider body of documentation and policies and procedures, IT disaster recovery plan, facilities management, and so forth that will be relevant. And you very quickly need to find these and reference them. And then an understanding of the external support. You probably have third-party service providers. I know International SOS are here, so you might be phoning them up. And also all the other public sector, regulator people that you're going to have to get in touch with. So a common operating picture should be a single, unified view of the truth. What we don't want is a situation whereby there's debate internally about what the nature of the situation is, or what the nature of the situation on the ground is. To some extent, this can exist at a basic level. This might be a number of Excel sheets, some Word documents, a news feed, some operational data. But as long as people in the crisis management team and those involved in the response have access to this data, then we can all sing off the same song sheet. At the more complex level, then we're talking about a combined command and control center. Depends on the nature of your operations. Companies like MTR and Jockey Club and CLP are going to have these in place because they need it for normal business operations. And it also provides a useful forum for understanding the nature of a serious incident and resourcing the response. Now, we were talking earlier about components of the crisis management plan, and I referenced decision-making framework. So a key risk in a crisis response is analysis paralysis. So the idea of that really is that you get into a situation where the enormity of the information that you have at your disposal, the complexity of the information and the high stakes puts you in a position where it's actually very difficult to make a decision. The stakes are too high, there's too much information. So what we need is a structured approach, a framework, a process to ensure that we can drive through to actionable decisions even in a high stakes situation. And here's a kind of idea of what that might look like. When I was talking about the division of command and control, this is where your chief of staff comes in. This is the person who can drive this decision-making process. At first, we identified that there is a requirement to make a decision. Are we going to close certain outlets? Are we going to stop certain service delivery? Are we going to notify a key stakeholder? We need to make a big decision. So we analyze the situation. We use the common operating picture and an information management process to understand what's actually happening, familiarize ourselves with the environment. Then we develop the intent. So we're understanding what we're prioritizing, I suppose. Are we aiming to maintain our compliance? Are we aiming to look after our people? Or do we want to keep service delivery at whatever cost? So what is it we're optimizing for? Then we can develop the course of action itself. We make a plan. We determine tasks within that plan. So there will be discrete functions and domains, business units at different levels, different geographies that have a part to play in executing this plan. And this is where you can start to devolve to the operational and tactical level. And then we execute and monitor. In a dynamic situation like a crisis, then your plan is not going to survive contact. There's no way that's going to happen. However, you need to drive some sort of decision. You then need to check and adjust the plan as it progresses, and that's the job of the crisis management team. So another important component will be a control hierarchy. So we have a very clear understanding in the crisis management plan or in the wider body of policies about what the roles and responsibilities are across the organization and how the interactions between these entities will progress. So some key components in that. Decision-making rights and authorizations. We can actually put this in black and white in the readiness component of crisis management, deciding who has what authority to do what, who notifies who can say, we're going to stop service now, or we're going to move to our IT hot site. Reporting protocols. What degree of regularity is information coming up from business units and down from country or regional or global headquarters? And how are we reporting laterally to our third parties, customers, suppliers? Where possible, we should aim towards local autonomy. This will allow a more agile response if we can devolve decision-making to those people closest to what is actually happening. And we also need to be clear about the escalation process. So when we identify a very severe decision that has to be made at the lower level, how do we get that up to the strategic body, the crisis management team, to make a decision? We need to be clear about how the public sector will have a vote in our response. Depending on the nature of your industry and how regulated you are, there's a strong chance that you won't have full autonomy or freedom of action. And where possible, this control hierarchy should be coherent with the existing business model and ethos. If you're highly centralized or highly decentralized, you should try to ensure that your crisis response is likewise. Now, I think reputation can probably be broken into three components. There's what we do, what we say, and what others say about us. And it's the job of the crisis communications component of the crisis management plan to look after number 2 and 3. So we need to also think that when we're responding to a crisis, there is an operational reality as well as a social narrative around that reality. We can't just talk, we also need to do. But equally, we can't just do, we need to communicate. And I know we've got a lot of communications professionals in the room. You'll be very familiar with this sort of process. And the key thing with crisis, planning for crisis, responding to crisis, is to connect these components very closely together. So the people doing your communications, both internally and externally, are aware of the facts of the matter, the investigation that's going on, the fix that's going on, the response that's going on. So I think the mantra used to be to manage the message. I think in the current age of social media hyper-transparency, it's probably more accurate to try to engage in the narrative where we're aware that we are one of a number of stakeholders in a complex conversation going on across a number of channels. And we need to try and demonstrate action and show leadership while not being aware that we can't completely control the message. An information management process will be critical. You'll be faced with an enormity of information in a crisis situation coming in from all sorts of different sources. Some of this will be conflicting, misinformation, disinformation. So if we're formalizing it in some way and recording it, then we're in a position to make better decisions, communications will have better transparency. It's also very important to think about whatever it is that's happening to your organization after the fact. There is likely to be litigation, investigation, and claims. So there's a high chance most of this information is going to be discoverable. So we need to think about how we're formalizing it. So we should think about capturing developing information as it happens. So when we make a certain decision, let's record that in the information management log, as well as recording what we knew at that time. So if it turns out to have been a horrendously bad decision, then at least we have the transparency that it was a good decision based on what we knew at the time. So also recording current actions, our rationale for those actions, and the alternatives that we considered. It's important also to think about how we're storing this information. This is going to be very sensitive. There'll be private information in this, sensitive information, corporate intellectual property as well. I think another defining component of crisis, along with reputational risk, to differentiate it from incident, is the likelihood that the public sector will have a great degree of involvement. So again, in the readiness stage, it's important to understand who those key stakeholders in the public sector are, to develop the relationships and the channels to speak with them, so that when the serious incident does occur, you already have the channels for enabling a response. In the best case scenario, you will be helped by the public sector. However, it's also important to consider perhaps emerging and frontier market considerations. If you have operations in the global south, there's a strong chance that the public sector may not be the panacea that you need in the situation of a severe disruption. And I think one lesson from the Inaminas attacks in Algeria in 2013 was that there was probably an over-reliance on the capability of the Algerian security forces. There wasn't an awareness on the part of some of the stakeholders involved of what their capability, or indeed lack of capability, to keep terrorist attacks away from the facility were. So that was a situation whereby the public sector was not perhaps improving the response, but perhaps impinging upon it. So hopefully now we've given a good view across what we understand the current global view of reputation risk to be, how some of our clients are understanding it and fitting it into existing risk management frameworks. Hopefully we've also, in the second part, given you an understanding of what a good crisis management program would look like and some of the granular processes you can go through to implement this. Mike mentioned at the beginning that we're doing another reputation risk survey at the moment. These were left on your chairs, and we'd be very grateful if you would give us some of your thoughts on how your organization understands reputation risk. So thank you very much for your time. I think we can move to some questions just now. And
we have lots of time for Q&A. So I'd like to open up the floor to everybody if you have any questions for Melissa or Neil, or both, or any comments or thoughts.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk more about the chief risk officer role. Someone from a more operational background, I'm always very suspicious of new C-level titles that seem more clerical than anything else. What makes a good chief risk officer? What makes a chief risk officer that actually adds value to the organization rather than simply being a coordinating point?
I think acting as a chief risk officer, of course, one of the basic roles and responsibilities is just what you mentioned, is to try to implement the risk management mechanism within the company, and to make sure that, for example, the risks are identified, assessed, and also managed. But this is just a very fundamental role of that chief risk officer. But I think another key aspects for a CRO is that he should be the one as a centralized point to gather information from the whole organizations. That means he should have the ability to, for example, gather some of the integrate the strategic risk, operation risk, financial risk, compliance risk, to understand the interlinkages, and also be sensitive enough to see about the interlinkages between different risks, and also advise the senior management how to deal with this. And it is not only about a coordination role, but I think the key essence is to act as a central point to make sure the risk within the different types of risks are not managed in silos, and also to understand the interlinkages between different risks within the organization.
What's the best background?
Because I know that in the market, when people are looking for CRO, very often they are trying, from my understanding, some of them will try to look at risk management guys from the FI, from FI industries. But as you can see, in the FI industry, I know that in the risk management department, they really do have people responsible for managing. They will separate that to manage operation risk and say a market risk, and some of them are financial risk like this. And then they will try to, because those people sit within the department, and that serves the centralized point that I just said before. And but on the other hand, besides having a very strong business sense of knowing the different interlinkages between the risk, and other key things is about the industry knowledge. This is also very important, serving as a background of the CRO.
I think adding to that, often you'll see that when there isn't a CRO, then risk is generally the responsibility of the CFO. So it depends on the nature of the organization and how much they want to resource risk management at the C level. If there's an identification that the CFO, while having a strong grasp of probably liquidity, market risk, credit risk, internal audit to some degree, maybe well across those financial risks, solvency risks, then, but you want to actually extend it into something of a more enterprise role, taking into account political risk and compliance risk, cybersecurity, perhaps some of these areas that really are not financial risks or not directly financial risks, then that is often when you see an identification of the need for a CRO, and perhaps someone who's come from a financial services background where the risk management function is generally very mature and developed, sits across financial risk as well as enterprise risk.
Other questions, comments?
I'd just like to ask how, in your analysis of how you deal with risk, one of the things that's happened in the last few years, in part to social media, is the speed at which you've got to respond to public attacks on your reputation. How do you coordinate under your model the rapidity that you need for that kind of corporate response? Who controls? I know you're saying you have to engage in the narrative as opposed to try and control it, but you've got to engage pretty fast, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I mean, my view is very much that the communications element is one component. So there needs to be the wider organizational response. If you have these horizon scanning structures in place and you're ready to respond with rapidity based on programmatic approach to this and a number of simulations, then you'll be in a position to spin the whole thing up more quickly than people who haven't spent time on this. So I think you're right. You need to be in a position where you're responding within minutes or hours rather than days, but you don't just want your communications function to be doing that. You want the whole wider piece. You want the legal aspect, the compliance, the investigation, the human resources, the cybersecurity, all of it coming together. So if you can stand up the crisis management team quicker, rather than later, then you can actually have the communications response based upon, as I said, the sort of operational reality. So in that sense, I would say, you've got to think about the whole program. You've got to think about who is establishing the escalation from incident to crisis, who is defining that it's time for the crisis management team to get together. And from that, you will then have some tangible information about what the nature of this is, how you're responding to it, that can be passed on to the communications subgroup or committee to push out. Then that's a question for the granularity of the crisis communications component of the crisis management plan, about how you're actually getting that information out there if you are going to use social media to try and respond very quickly and to counter perhaps what is already a social media threat to you.
I have some context that I can provide there. I just left Boeing as head of Corp Comm and branding and advertising. And to that point, we had planned well in advance for major events such as airplane accidents and so forth, working with the various departments, legal and everybody else. One example was Asiana 777, which happened last year. Guy came off the plane and was shooting video that transferred into Twitter in 7 minutes or whatever it was. We knew we had to be prepared to respond quickly, and we did. The The airline, however, and this kind of leads to a question about perceptions of needing to prepare plans such as this in Asia Pacific. They didn't respond for 2 days. And you know, clearly that's not a very good place to be. In fact, we talked to the CorpCom guy and said, are you going to head to San Francisco for this? He was in Los Angeles. He said, yeah, I'm going to drive up. I thought, well, that's great. What are you going to be able to do during that 12 hours you're driving up there? But to the point, 48% of the people in Asia Pacific think they need to develop plans to deal with these types of events. 32%, I think it was, in the Americas. I'm assuming that in the United States, mostly, we're talking about here, it's mature. That process is mature. Opacity probably trumps transparency out here. Can you address at all the need that people see in order to be more transparent and to deal with these kinds of crises which become public events?
Yeah, I'll have a few thoughts on that. I think you're right. You know, there's different starting points. So when we're looking at 48% of Asia Pacific respondents saying they are trying to set up crisis management plans and processes, that's from a lower degree than the organizations in EMEA and Americas. So this process occurred decades ago in those markets, and there's a degree of catch-up going on. But then I don't think it's an entirely linear process whereby organizations in Asia Pacific need to just follow exactly what has been done previously. I think there are specific sets of risks in Asia Pacific that need to be considered. Geopolitically, I think the risk environment is more complex. That's not to say that it isn't in Europe, because it is certainly, but we've certainly got more bilateral geopolitical risks at play in Asia Pacific just now. I think the regulatory environment in China has been a very complex one for the last couple of years, especially for multinationals, understanding how regulation is developing and trying to mitigate the risks of falling foul of anti-corruption investigations, both internally or through third parties or other companies that they're allied to. And then we've got developing legislation in Hong Kong at the moment with the competition ordinance and so forth. So there's also a different human factor here as well, different understandings of the value of risk management, the talent that you can acquire in the market as well. And I think also there's probably a greater degree of risk to natural catastrophe as well. You've also got more extended supply chain and more complex, well, probably less secure infrastructure across a lot of Asia Pacific. So I suppose there is a different risk environment here, which needs to be responded to effectively. Where a multinational has a sort of global crisis management or business continuity or resiliency program in place, that needs to be localized because there are different risks at play here. So what we were looking at, that data there is a driver of two trends, I suppose, coming together. One is that lesser degree of maturity from the outset and a degree of catching up with EMEA and Americas. And another is an understanding of a complex local risk environment that needs to be responded to.
Yeah, I have one question for you. I think that there's a little bit less in terms of disagreement on the crisis phase and how to go about that, more on the day-to-day management of reputation and the potential for a lot of organizations to have something like a CRO in the organization. I think that you get back to the question of evaluation. How do you evaluate your activities? And one of the things about reputation is very hard to determine how to quantify reputation. And we talk about things like political risk being a part of reputation risk. Well, political risk is also one thing that's very, very hard to quantify. While on a day-to-day basis, I think that a lot of us can understand the value of managing the reputation, I think that some people, myself included, would like to know a little bit more about how you go about quantifying the reputation itself and how other organizations can do that.
As I said before, if you really want to quantify the reputation of a company, it is very, very difficult to do that. Because, as I said before, if we define reputation, it's just a perception of your company. It is a measurement against the expectations with the actual performance. And but so that's why we totally understand that a reputation risk cannot be managed alone, or it cannot be managed in silos, because there will be other drivers or risks that is interrelated to that reputation risk. Or you can say reputation is a result of something happened. I mean, poor reputation is a result of something happened, or something, or the happening of other risks. So that's why, back to the basic, is that many companies are focusing on the key drivers for those reputation risks, rather than just. Of course, if you talk about reputation risk, you can say, "Oh, I do lots of advertising. I engage with the media to promote my image." But this is just one side of it. But the underlying, the most fundamental thing is how to deal with those drivers that will affect the reputation of your company.
I think a very interesting exercise that I haven't personally undertaken, but would be just a fantastic project, would be to try and develop some sort of quantitative tool to actually understand reputation risk on a day-to-day monitoring basis, rather than, let's just do it when we're in a crisis stage. And there's a number of things you could feed into that. If you're analyzing the entirety of content that references your organization across traditional media and social media, and then you're assigning some sort of sensitivity to that content, then you've got some data there. Then you can also be surveying previous customers, existing customers as well, using a sort of net promoter score mechanism to, again, drive to a number. There's probably a number of other variables you can consider for data inputs into this. It'd be a very interesting exercise to try and consider all the ways that you could quantify reputation, pull it all together into one sort of dashboard, and use that as a day-to-day monitoring of where you're sitting reputationally. I think that'd be fascinating.
Fortunately, oftentimes you'd still be wrong.
Quite possibly.
Are there any other questions from anybody before we? Yes.
So in terms of whether it's clients that you guys currently work with, or just people that you guys have read about or know about in the industry, who do you think, what company or what types of companies are really doing this really, really well, and what are they doing so different compared to others, either within their industry or airlines and others who are susceptible to a lot of these types of big risks?
My initial reaction is it's those companies that understand that the continuity of their business is very much based on the public sphere. So those ones that are sort of B2C, I suppose, rather than B2B. That would probably be my initial reaction of which companies are doing this better. So hotels, gaming, airlines, these retail banks, these kind of companies that are very dependent on the immediate public perception of how they're conducting businesses, the quality of the products and services, their ethics and compliance, and so forth. Those companies that are in that space tend to have a more developed and mature understanding of this.
We have time for one more if anybody else has something to add. And if not, then that concludes our event. I'm sure Neil and Melissa may be around for a few minutes afterward if anybody has other questions for them specifically. But for now, that concludes our session, and I would like to give some tokens of our appreciation on behalf of AmCham. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Melissa. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon. See you the next time.